Hi, welcome to class. Today, the first thing we did was we focused on the Aztec civilization. So I quickly just read through this PowerPoint to give a little background knowledge on the Aztecs. Last week we had talked about the Mayans. One second, just making sure that works. We had talked about the Mayans last week. So Aztec Empire spread throughout most of Mexico. Down in southern part of Mexico was where the Mayans existed. But ironically, these two empires never really interacted. But they did originate starting by Lake Texcoco, which was their major city. So they did live on a lake, but they did expand out into Mexico. So the Aztec location, the reason they picked where they did, it was actually a famous legend that one of their gods would come down as an eagle, and they needed to find this eagle perched on top of a cactus with a snake in its mouth, which is currently the picture that is on Mexico's flag. Apparently, they did find this, so wherever that was, that's where they had to live. When they found this eagle, the land was extremely dry. It was like living in a desert. So they had to find new ways to shift from hunting to farming. So they did this by building their major city, Technicalan, in the middle of a lake. So it was in a very elaborate fortress. So on this lake, they literally basically built their own land and then different roadways to connect to the rest of Mexico. And this is a modern day photo of this. So they built pyramids and temples very similar to the Mayans, but these were magnificent. They were huge, absolutely huge. Their government, because they're really famous for their government, and we will spend time this week talking about them. They have a king slash emperor at the top. Nobles and priests also were up in the higher part of it. Nobles served as judges, officials, and governors. They also wore elaborate gold jewelry, so gold was a very relevant material. Most crimes were punishable by death or being sold into slavery. Their economy was very much based on agriculture, meaning farming. So, again, this word chinapas, which is floating gardens, that they had to build more land because they didn't have enough of it. So they filled it in the lakes, creating these little garden beds that could float. Their main source of food was corn, squash, and beans. Their economy was usually conquering others to pay tribute and the money they paid towards the conquered people. Their religion, which is what kind of makes them famous, they are polytheistic. Their chief god, Huitzilopochtli, was believed to be a sun god, that every single day he had a fight with darkness each night to raise the sun. So because this was a fight, there was no promise the sun would win. So they began to sacrifice to ensure the sun would rise, which is where we famously get human sacrifices. About 20,000 people per year. Bodies were taken to the top of the pyramids. Usually the heart was ripped out and the bodies were thrown off because the heart was the most valuable. Usually these sacrifices were prisoners of war, some slaves, and some nobles that volunteered. Constant warfare was necessary, so the Aztecs are going to really pride themselves in fighting because they're going to have to in order to get enough prisoners to sacrifice. One second. Okay, sorry, just checking something. And some historians even say bodies were eaten by royalty. I cannot confirm nor deny that. These are some famous paintings. You see these a lot in Mayan culture, but this was actually more of the Aztec culture. And this famous picture is where they thought maybe royalty ate some body flesh, but it cannot be confirmed nor denied if that's true. You then have what is called a merchant class. So you did have groups of people that made weapons, ropes. They would carry most of their goods on their back. So most trading occurred by foot or by a small boat. You then had your commoners, were the people who farmed the land. Commoners did have a right to improve their status by becoming a warrior and capturing and killing enemies, which gave them an improvement to their status. You did have landless peasants wandering in search of work, usually for farming. And then we did have the slave class. Slaves were usually prisoners of war and criminals, so do not compare it to American slavery. So these people were not bought and sold. And slaves could own land and could eventually buy back their freedom if they earned enough money. Some famous pictures, and I will upload this to Google Classroom once I'm done teaching Incas next week. Priests were the keepers of knowledge and the writers of history. So keep in mind, these famous pictures that we get were all done by the priest. Priests also ran schools for the sons of the nobles. So they did have an actual education system. Unfortunately, it did not apply to women or the commoners. They did create a calendar similar to the Mayans, which was a 365-day calendar. They also did predict that the world was going to end at 2012. I think it was just more because their calendar, they didn't have enough time to make anymore. In modern day medicine, they did create some modern day medicine with herbs. Prisoners of war, they would study their bodies and learn how to set back bones. So if it's a broken arm, they could set it. And they believed a lot in steam baths used as treatment to help break fevers. Eventually, they're going to end. And it's a famous story. It's actually been turned into a Disney story. If you've ever seen Road to El Dorado on Disney Plus. But the Spanish came in 1519 looking mostly for gold and glory. They said they were going to spread the word of God, of Christianity, but really it was for gold. The Aztecs were their first ones they wanted to take over because Aztecs did have a lot of gold. But Hernando Cortez, or Hernan Cortez, was a very, very brutal man. But when he came in, one of their famous legends was that the sun god would come down to earth being part animal, part human, and would have hair that was on fire. That when Hernando Cortez came in, they had never seen a horse before. So he was literally riding on a horse, and to a group of people, that didn't make a whole lot of sense because they'd never seen that. Imagine seeing a massive animal for the first time in your life. He also had red hair, which they thought was a sign because they had never, again, seen red hair before. And he was covered in silver body armor, that they literally thought he was a god. Unfortunately, because of this, and this is a famous painting of them treating Hernando Cortez as a god, they let the entire Spanish fleet into their capital city, allowing it to be open for attack. That Hernando Cortez is going to come, witness them doing human sacrifices, and be appalled, and decides it's our moral obligation to kill these people. So even though they thought they were doing the right thing, treating him like a god, Hernando Cortez did not treat them with the same respect. But 3/4 of the Aztecs are going to die from him, and they're also going to die from disease, that mostly smallpox, that the Mayans and Aztecs had never encountered a lot of European diseases because you grow immune to them over time. So Spanish were fine because they were used to smallpox and malaria and other diseases, but they had not had an immune system for it. So it actually killed most of the Aztecs, was diseases. Okay. So then in class, what we did after that, we did work on Rise of an Empire. Rise of an Empire. So I please encourage you. I know a lot of times we watch these videos just so we can copy. Please read through these. They look long, but they're not difficult to read. If you practice reading and trying to summarize, you will do better. You will learn a lot more. So please don't forget, we have a warm-up question that when does a civilization become an emperor? My first class answered things like, oh, it's when they have a government, or it's when they have stable food supply or land. Okay, any suitable answer, but please just make sure you do that. Then for each source, you are explaining this question. How did geography contribute to the rise of that empire? How did geography affect? So a lot of these answers we have covered from last week. So it's a repeat about geography. Okay, so the first one dealt with the Aztecs. So this class, there was a couple answers they came up with. The Aztecs were really trying to expand their land. And by doing that, that really helped their economy because they realized they could make what is called chinapas, aka floating gardens, to expand their land. That's going to give them more land equals more power. Where it says about the picture, you are to insert a picture from the web. You're not to draw it. To do that, you go to insert image, search the web. What picture do you put? Anything that you type up is suitable for you to put down. So say you put chinapas, type in chinapas. Maybe you put a picture of a lake, something that summarizes what you wrote. Number 2 also talked about the Aztecs. Aztecs were famous for building canoes and boats because they lived on a lake. this allowed them to have trading. So they were able to trade different things because they had easy access to every part of their city. That it was very easy to get around their city, which eventually is going to be their downfall. But in the beginning, that was actually a good thing. So again, insert a photo. Number 3 talks about the Incas. The Incas actually had a very rough start to their civilization because they couldn't find a good land to settle in. So eventually they had to settle in the Andes Mountains. And then in source 4, we're going to learn that the Incas actually enjoyed the mountains because it gave them access to gold and silver, which was valuable, and religiously, they believed in higher elevation, that the higher to the clouds you were, the closer you were to different types of gods. So it actually worked out for them to live in those Andes Mountains. But source 4 is also going to talk about, and we'll talk more next week, that Incas, because they live in the mountains, it is very difficult to live in a mountain range. That they're going to have to really adapt in order to live in those mountains. So a good picture for that one would be a picture of a mountain. The Mayas settled. The last one is about the Mayans. Theirs was short and sweet, so please make sure you're reading. Mayas settled in one spot, allowing them to stay secure from invasion. So we talked last week that Mayans literally were surrounded by a rainforest, that the Incas and Aztecs are never, because the Mayans were kind of in the middle, are never going to discover the Mayans, which was really helpful for them. And even when the Spanish came over to take over, it really helped out because their geography protected them. So a good picture there could be a picture of the rainforest, anything that you read. Okay, but please make sure you are, in fact, reading these. We then talked about the FBT, Rise of an Empire. This is your exit slip, which is why I say it's important to read, because then this makes this part real easy. Explain how geography contributed to the rise of the American empires. Use at least 2 sources, meaning use at least 2 of these that we just filled out. Notice it's the exact same question. Okay, so if you do this part should be real easy. You are summarizing what you learned. Okay, summarizing. That does not mean you highlight and copy and paste. You have to put things in your own words. Okay, and once you do that, you hit submit. The other 2 assignments we will do on Thursday.